We'll begin with the first paper, and just in the order Basil gave them to me, with Brother Jeff Trueman. And Brother Jeff Trueman is coming to us from the Institute of Dispute Resolution, Pepperdine University, School of Law. And his paper is Islamic Identity Conflict and the Symbolic Sectarianism of Sunni and Shia as seen through Hofstede's cultural dimensions.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Jeff Trueman, and I'd like to discuss a topic that we hear about often in the news about conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Essentially, I think it's really important to understand that there are many Muslims who have lived together for generations. And for those who understand English, the one in the middle is the one I really like because it's a blend and it's kind of comical to say I am sushi. It's to sort of say the next generation might be able to establish another way to look at this problem. At least that's my hope. We're going to change the slide. Go ahead, you can change the slide. Is there a clicker or something that I can use, or
Just wave your hand.
just wave my hand? Okay, well, all right. So essentially, the differences between Sunni and Shia, it may sound like, it may feel like it's a religious divide, but essentially it's political. And I think it's very important to understand why that is and how that comes about. So this presentation will talk about the problem through the lens of Gert Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Essentially, Mr. Hofstede worked for an American company called IBM, and he studied cultures throughout the world and came up with a number of criteria called cultural dimensions, a paradigm through which he could analyze the cultures and try to get an understanding as to, and he would rate them and score them and try to understand how they would think about the future, how they relate to authority, how they relate to group or individual dynamics, whether it be a group inclusion or group exclusion, and so on. So this problem of sectarianism is analyzed through the work of Gert Hofstede. And because the politics in the Middle East is very complicated, you have to think about not only the Sunni Shia as religious identity, but also think about it as ethnic identity, Arab, Persians, and think about it as national identity, Saudis and Iranians. No, it's okay, go ahead. So essentially, Gert Hofstede's summation is to say that culture is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes one group from another. It's essentially a way to try to understand the world and its various cultures. Go ahead. So he came up with his first book, which was a landmark work, pioneering the cross-cultural understanding through his paradigm of cultural dimensions. And essentially, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, you see the 5 dimensions. You see power distance. That's how people who don't have authority, who don't have power, how they relate to those who have it. And I'll explain why it's defined like that in just a minute. Can you go back just for a second? Uncertainty avoidance. How cultures deal with the unknowns of the future. That's an important element. Individualism versus collectivism. I touched on that. That's an important element. Masculinity and femininity. I didn't deal with that issue in my paper, although there is some of Hofstede's scoring, and there is some commentary in the literature about how Sunni and Shia may have qualities of one and the other. For the interests of space and time, I bypass that, but we can talk about that later if you want. And then time orientation, how one deals with the here and now versus the future. Go ahead. So in terms of individual and inclusion, that's essentially a graphic, I think, that makes it very clear. You can go ahead to what the problem is. Uncertainty avoidance deals with the tolerance of uncertainty and ambiguity as it refers to search for the truth. Power distance, the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations expect that the power will be distributed unequally. So think about how that's defined, because it will make sense to you later. Go ahead. And then here, you have long-term versus short-term orientation. I tried to give you a sense, the pictures to the left, obviously long-term. The two to the right are more short-term orientation. And essentially, the divide between Sunni and Shia breaks down. It's very, very detailed. It's very historical. And it's very nuanced. But I wanted to just, if you can go back for a second, just to point out that essentially you can think of it as how to think about God, how to think about the interpretation of the Quran, and how to treat authority. And this chart to the far right makes, I think, kind of very clear, because there's two approaches to how the Prophet Muhammad, how the descendants, and how the ascendant of what am I trying to say, the throne, that's not the best word for it, but who would follow. And so you have Sunnis on one side saying that it should be chosen by consensus, and Shia saying, no, it should have some relation to family and bloodline. And so the first three caliphs on the right side were essentially the Sunnis won out in terms of their approach, and that it should be more of a consensus. And then with the fourth caliph, Ali, that's when the Shia believed, okay, this is our first Imam, and they bought into it because there was some connection between Ali and the Prophet Muhammad. So that's just, and I don't want to get into that, that can take up a lot of time with regard to the detail, but I just wanted to highlight the essential differences. So you understand and have some context for it. And here's a map that essentially shows the population distribution. Shia Muslim are maybe 10 to 15% of the total Middle Eastern population of all Muslims. Right. And so the basic difference is, and this is what I was trying to think of before, the source of authority. Where should the inquiring mind go when the Quran might not be clear? And I just listed a few of the variations between Sunni, Shia, and Sufi, but there's many, many, many more. And so just to be fair, I just wanted to highlight that, just again for background information. So go ahead. Sorry, go to the next one. So essentially going to the cultural dimensions. Inclusion versus exclusion. This is a very, very powerful weapon that helps to create the fanaticism that we were talking about earlier. It has to be with identity. It talks about how to be a Muslim. Each one is claiming exclusivity to that. And it has to do with a very complex historical narrative about the differences in how to interpret the historical narrative of what happened after the Prophet Muhammad passed away. There are internal divisions, and how they can be managed and dealt with is really the challenge. And it's a dualistic, equally dependent. That's why I call it symbiotic, because one depends on the other for its identity. And there may be other examples of that in the world where it's not just Sunni Shia. But as I mentioned too, you have ethnic divisions, and you also have national divisions, whereas a lot of concern on behalf of not only Sunni Muslims, but those in the West and other allies of Jamaica are concerned about quote-unquote Shia ambitions, political ambitions, and so on. Number two, so that's inclusion-exclusion. In terms of anxieties and opportunities that would come in the future. Can you stay on that for a second? Again, dealing with society's tolerance for uncertainty. How comfortable can you be not knowing the future in terms of your search for the truth? So, cultures generally deal with religion and law and other institutions to try to help us manage the future, to try to reduce our anxiety, give us some measure of certainty. In the Middle East, is generally a high uncertainty avoidance area, meaning that we don't really like not knowing. We want to try to control what's going to happen. Go back a second. So extremists with little or no tolerance for truth from others will react. Lethal penalties against those who are on the outside of the group, as I just mentioned. Proxy battles. Some of you may be familiar. what's happening in any of the hot spots in the Middle East are more often than not a proxy battle between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's Arab Persian, Sunni Shia. And economic uncertainty, humiliation with oil, any kind of powerful resource is going to create that economic imbalance. And to the extent that it creates any kind of shame and humiliation, for those who do that kind of trauma-informed work here, know how powerful that is in terms of stoking violence and conflict. Number 3, power distance. Again, the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations expect and accept that power will be distributed unevenly. So it's those who don't have, it's essentially might makes right. Go ahead. How to deal with authority and religion. Saudi Arabia is a strict Islamic state. Although Iran is a democracy, you still have elements of religious authority there. And again, that's why you see so many of the crackdowns in the Arab Spring, and what started the Syrian civil war was essentially a dispute over water, and now you have this. Leaders are expected to look powerful. It's almost as if the culture expects them to employ might makes right measures. Revolutions come and go, and yet the same violence tends to just take its place from the prior regime. And so those are just a couple pictures to kind of make the point of what power distance is like from the perspective of those who don't have it. As I mentioned, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Iranian democracy, and I believe the most recent president in Iran, I liked the quote that he had said, that he doesn't see democracy as a gift from the West. It's more of a heritage from Ali, who became caliph only when people showed him support. So I thought that was an interesting cultural perspective on what we think of as a Western institution. Power distance in terms of how economics and oil play out. Large Shia populations live in oil-rich areas of Iran. Other oil-rich areas are controlled by Saudi Arabia and by proxy other nations. Economic uncertainty and humiliation leads to sectarianism and violence. And you can see, I think that's a good cartoon that makes the point of the proxy battles that we see. How long will this fight last? Only 14 or 15 centuries. Power distance on a global scale, as you can see, again, another example of the proxy, US, Russia, backed with arms, money, and other. Short-term orientation, this is the other cultural dimension here. Traditions are viewed as sacrosanct. Fundamentalism, the future is in the hands of God, radicalizes those with short-term orientation. It's agenda-driven, and again, going back to the in-group, out-group, it's an effort to reclaim and sort of maintain purity. Immediate gratification is expected, social obligations way more than the costs. So there's not much worry about whether this particular action or this particular spate of violence will have many long-term consequences. It's not really on the register. So you can see when you start to mix these factors all together, you get the dynamic between the Sunni, Shia, Saudi, Iranian, Arab, Persian. And if you're a non-believer, I'm the Muslim. No, I'm the Muslim. No, I am. And you just get this constant escalation over generations. And it becomes intractable. So, is change possible? I think that's the element here to try to push this question forward. And in my humble opinion, the only way, and this has been done in other ethnic and religious disputes, is to try to share power in some way. It will lower distance in terms of the power distance definition that we were talking about, and will increase autonomy, which is really what this whole thing is about anyway. And there are examples of this. Saddam Hussein granted wider autonomy to some clerics in exchange for fewer challenges to his regime. Now, that's all relative because he was pretty brutal, but yet he had power sharing agreements. And in Kuwait, the state was founded in a way that did not require a conquest as it did in other states, so that you have the sort of beginnings of a power-sharing culture that grew into the country of Kuwait. And then with regard to reducing uncertainty and long-term orientation, that takes time and trust. And I would say humanization. I would say, you know, starting small and doing what you can and hoping that your message maybe takes root with the younger generation who will see the light and eventually bring it into an institutional level. So that's essentially what I'm explaining, but then also trying to take past into the next generation. So now's the time for questions.